Welcome everybody to Pusey House. Welcome to our third recollection lecture of this term. The recollection lectures are about recovering some of the key themes and thinkers from the Christian tradition. And we have a very packed program of lectures and conferences this term. If you don't know about that, please take away with you one of these term cards as you leave. There are lots of them available in the corridor. For instance, next week we have a lecture by the former MP John Cruddas about Catholicism and the Labour Party. Next Wednesday we have a conference on Anglo-Catholic socialism. We have conferences coming up on confession and post-liberalism and on the possibilities of a Christian revival in public life. And we have an event about prison ministry as well later this term. So please take away with you one of these if you'd like to know more. Also during our lecture I'll circulate a clipboard where you can write down your name and email if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, which allows you to be informed about all the academic events that we have going on. And finally, it just remains for me to introduce our speaker for this evening. The Reverend Professor Sian Grønlie is the Professor of Old Norse in the Faculty of English at the university, and she's a tutorial fellow at St Anne's College. She has a particular research interest in medieval conversion narratives, biblical interpretations, literary accounts of Iceland's conversion to Christianity, and women in Old Norse literature. She is a curate at St Giles Church and St Margaret's, and we are extremely grateful to her for speaking to us this evening. Her lecture is entitled Reading the Old Testament Through the Lens of Icelandic Sagas. Please join me in welcome.
So thank you very much for inviting me to give a talk this afternoon. And I want to start by saying that the kind of audience that I'm used to speaking to on the whole is an audience who knows the sagas much better than the Bible, whereas I imagine that here today there are some people among you who may know the Bible quite a lot better than the sagas. So what I've done is I've tried to kind of flip the sort of talk that I usually give, so that instead of talking about how reading the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible can help us to understand the sagas, I'm going to try to talk about how reading the sagas might help us to understand the Old Testament, the Bible. So you'll have to forgive me if at any point I slip into assuming too much knowledge of the sagas or too little knowledge of the Bible. I thought I would start by saying something about what a saga is, because that's not as straightforward as it might seem. The word saga in itself means tale, story, narrative. It doesn't refer to any one genre. So for example, the saga of St Edmund is a saint's life. The saga of Yvain is a translation of a French romance, Yvain. And the saga of the Romans is a translation of Lucan and Sallust, so classical history. But what most people mean when they talk about the Icelandic sagas is the sagas of Icelanders. And this is a type of saga that's unique to Iceland. The sagas of Icelanders are stories about the families and descendants of the first settlers of Iceland. Iceland was settled in about 870, and the sagas are set in the 10th and early 11th centuries. And that's interesting because Iceland was converted to Christianity in the year 1000, so the sagas span that conversion period. Unlike most other medieval literature, sagas give us detailed accounts of the lives of ordinary people: farmers, chieftains, mercenaries, poets, outlaws, and so on. But there's a gap between when the sagas are set in the 10th and 11th centuries and when they were written down in the 13th and 14th centuries. And this has a few corollaries. Firstly, none of the sagas are pagan, so some of them are set in pagan times, but all the saga authors were Christians and their audiences were Christian. Secondly, sagas are not oral, so they may have drawn on oral tradition and they use oral formulas, but they're the product of a literary culture. At the same time, they're not novels. You'll know that if you've ever tried to read one. They may have fictional elements, but they're about real historical people, and they're set in real geographical places, and they're anonymous. They don't belong to any one individual. They belong to the community that produced them and that reads them. If you go to Iceland, which you should, you can visit many of the places mentioned in the sagas, and I've just got up here the site of the General Assembly, or Althing, which was held once a year, and many sagas have scenes set precisely here. And as you can see, it's exactly on the mid-Atlantic fault line, which makes it a stunning backdrop to the human dealings that take place there. The other bit of context that's useful to know is that the Old Testament was well known in Iceland. So there are Old Norse translations, pre-Reformation, of the historical or narrative portions of the Old Testament, and these are known collectively as stjórn, probably means something like rule or reign. And stjórn includes 3 separate translations. A translation of Genesis and Exodus, dates to the beginning of the 14th century. A summary of the rest of the Pentateuch, which is probably 15th century. And a translation of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and the 4 books of Kings, so 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings, which dates to the mid-13th century, so contemporary with when many of the sagas were being written down. And stjórn survives in some very beautiful illuminated manuscripts, AM 227 folio on the right, which was kept at the Episcopal See in the south of Iceland at Skálholt, and AM 226 folio, which is on the left, which was kept at the Augustinian House of Canons in the southwest of Iceland at Helgafell. And I just want to show you some of the illuminations here. So this is the first page of, it's the sort of preface to Genesis. So you've got God sitting in majesty, or Christ sitting in majesty at the top of the page. Then the illustrator has used the left-hand margin to show the fall of the angels. So you start with angels at the top, and you can see about halfway through they start transforming into devils, and then they're dropping into the mouth of hell here. And then at the bottom you've got the creation happening quite haphazardly over here, and then Adam and Eve eating apples from the tree with the snake coiled round it at the bottom there. And then there's this one, so this is Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, catching Abraham in the act of raising his sword, you know, the moment of decision where you know that he is prepared to kill his son, and the angel catching it from behind, and the ram in the margin to substitute for Isaac. And then at the bottom here you've got Abraham departing from Haran with Sarah, who looks like she's trying to persuade him to stay. And Lot, who's trying to drag this really stubborn cow out of the town, and it's just refusing to go. So already we've got here some quite sophisticated reflections on the biblical narrative and its meanings. So why might the sagas be useful or interesting for studying the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament? When I was a graduate student, I went to a series of seminars on medieval narrative, which was convened by Heather O'Donoghue, who's here, and Thomas Charles Edwards. And the first seminar was given by a young theologian that I later realised was John Barton. And he talked to us about how biblical narrative works in the story of David and Bathsheba. And we were all astounded by the similarities between biblical style, as he described it, and saga style, which none of us were aware of. Then when I started working on these Old Norse translations of the Old Testament, I read John Barton's History of the Bible from 2019. And this is what he says about the oldest level of style in the Hebrew Bible. He says, "This is a plain, laconic style, in which hardly anything is said about the emotions or the appearances of the characters, and we're left to make our own deductions about what is going on beneath the surface. I call this saga style, because the parallel with the clipped style of the Icelandic sagas seems to me to make it appropriate." And I had this moment of epiphany where I realised that the reason why I like the stories in the Old Testament so much is because they're just like sagas. So the first thing that I set out to do was to prove to myself that this resemblance was real and not just a product of reading things in translation. And as I explored some of the biblical scholarship on Hebrew narrative, I realised that actually this resemblance to the sagas was mentioned relatively often, and even that some scholars of the Hebrew Bible have really depended on it. The earliest reference I found was in the third edition of Herman Gunkel's huge commentary on Genesis from 1910. And in it, Gunkel compares Jacob's nocturnal wrestling with an angel in Genesis 32 to the Icelandic legends of Grettir and of Ormur Sturluson. Now, the comparison between Grettir and Jacob is actually very close, I think probably closer than Gunkel realised. But Gunkel clearly didn't know anything about Ormur Sturluson, because his fight with a man-eating giant and his monstrous cat-shaped mother isn't nocturnal and has nothing in common with Jacob's wrestling. So I think Gunkel probably got that reference from an intermediary, probably a German article on Die Beowulf's saga from 1903. But the interesting thing about Gunkel's reference here is that the saga of Grettir was edited in German for the first time in 1900, and the commentary dates to 1910. So this is close to the earliest point in German scholarship at which a comparison between an Icelandic saga and a biblical story could actually be made. At the same time, when Gunkel talks about sagas, what he means most of the time is the German saga with an E, which means something more like legend or tale. So in his book entitled Die Sagen der Genesis, translated as The Legends of Genesis, he comes up with 6 criteria for identifying sagas in the Old Testament, only one of which might conceivably apply to an Icelandic saga. Instead, he uses the term saga to mean popular stories in distinction to proper history. So he talks about the biblical author as a primitive saga man. And the term saga is used in a similar way by Gerhard von Rad in his commentary on Genesis. So he talks about the story of Cain and Abel as a tribal saga, the fall of Babel as an etiological saga, and the near sacrifice of Isaac as a cult saga. But the story of Abraham, the novella of Joseph, and above all the David story, he says are much too sophisticated and masterful to be sagas. These are, I quote, genuine historical writing. But everything he says about the David story is strikingly similar to the way that I would describe an Icelandic saga. Then we come on to biblical scholars who have read quite a few sagas. And one of these is George Coates. He published a commentary on Genesis in 1983. And Coates defines a saga as a long traditional prose narrative with an episodic structure developed around stereotypical themes or topics. And he adds, as an aside, see the Icelandic sagas. And he writes well about how in both you get this entwining of family history and national history. Then there's Robert Neff, who has a chapter entitled Saga in a collection of essays from 1984, edited by Coates, in fact. And he makes a list of all the things that the Icelandic sagas have in common with biblical sagas, and these include economy of detail, the description of character through action, the use of genealogy, and the conglomerate character of the interrelated narratives. And he takes the word conglomerate right out of W.P. Kerr's Epic and Romance, which has got quite a few chapters on the sagas, so he'd clearly been reading that. And Neff asserts that Genesis 12 to 25 should rightly be called the saga of Abraham. Then, finally, there's John van Seter, whose understanding of the sagas is distinctly Icelandic. So he says, he's writing about the story of David, I want to propose the term saga in the specific meaning of the Icelandic and Norse sagas as the most appropriate comparative literature for the David story, and he calls his book The Biblical Saga of King David. And Van Zetten has a list of the defining features of a saga, and it's a pretty good one. I think I agree with everything on there. So he says that a saga, A, deals with the founding age of a people and extends over more than one generation. B, is based on older written historical records, but many of its details are fictional. C, its anonymity is an aspect of style and is used to create a veneer of realism. D, it's intended as serious entertainment. He got that phrase from Magnus Magnusson. E, uses type scenes and traditional motifs, but as literary conventions and not oral survivals. And finally, expresses nostalgia for a glorious past, but can also parody it and subvert traditional narrative patterns. So we've arrived here at a point where both the Icelandic sagas and the David story are being recognised as sophisticated narratives. And David Damrosch also describes how the Icelandic sagas, like the Deuteronomist, recall, collect and adapt stories from the settling and the founding of the nation. Then there's narrative art. And what's interesting about this is that both biblical scholars and Old Norse scholars have written independently on style, but using language that is almost identical. So for example, biblical style is described as condensed, saga style is described as compact, biblical style is described as spare, while saga style is described as sparse. The biblical narrators are called masters of observation, while the saga author is called a dispassionate observer. The biblical narrators follow a strategy of self-effacement, while in the sagas we find the self-effacement of the narrative voice. So you see what I mean. And on this slide here, you can see a list of things that I pulled out, mainly from Robert Alter's book on biblical narrative, which could apply equally well to the Icelandic sagas. So things like anonymous, objective narration, minimal authorial intrusion, characterization through speech and action, economy of expression. At the bottom, complex moral and psychological realism, the use of gaps and blanks. I mean, nobody would blink if I used this list as a description of the characteristic style of the Icelandic sagas. And to give you an example of this, I want to look briefly at a passage from Hrafnkel's saga that exemplifies some of the ways in which saga narrative is like biblical narrative. I'm sorry that I don't have this on a slide. I do have it on the handout, which I realise that not everybody has a copy of, but I will read it out, so at least some of you will be able to hear it. It's a scene that takes place in the first chapter of the saga, when Hallfreður comes to Iceland with his wife and son and settles in a place called Goat Valley, Geitdalur. And this is what happens. One night, he dreamed that a man appeared to him and said, "There you lie, Hallfreður, and rather unwarily. Move your farm away and west over Lagerfljót. There is all your good fortune." After that, he wakes up and moves his farm out over Rangá at Tunga to a place that was later called Hallfreður's Stead, Hallfreður's Place, and he lived there until old age. And he left behind a goat and a buck. And the same day that Hallfreður left, a landslide fell on the house and these precious animals were killed, and from then on it was called Goat Valley. So in this passage you can see that there are both shared interests and a shared style. And the shared interests have to do with place names and the connections between stories and places, but also an interest in the first settlers and their relationship to the land that they're settling, to which they're guided by supernatural or divine powers. The role of the supernatural in this story seems to be to direct Hallfreður to the place where he's meant to settle and where he will thrive, so where his good fortune is. This encounter has something in common with Jacob's wrestling with an angel, in that it's a nocturnal encounter with a supernatural being who's described simply as a man. And this being directs him then to cross a body of water, so lagerfljót, and promises him good fortune or luck. Then there's the style. And if you look at this passage in conjunction with this slide, you can see that the narrative is indeed objective and anonymous. It describes rather than evaluates. There's something a bit unusual about it in the sense that we're told what Hjartolfræður is dreaming, which suggests that the saga author can be omniscient if he wants to. Usually dreams are told to another person, and that's how we hear about them. But we're not given any causal links between events. We're told that Hjartolfræður had a dream, after that he moved, and after that there was a landslide. But we're not told how he reacted to the dream, or even that he left because of it, although that's implied. We're not told what or who causes the landslide, or how the mysterious visitor knows about it. Does he warn Hjartolfræður because he has foreknowledge, or does he actually cause the landslide himself?
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think in the handout there is no corresponding passage from the Bible, from the Old Testament.
No, I didn't put an Old Testament passage for that one. Yeah, so I'm just talking about it in general terms. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fine. Yeah, and we're also not told why Hjartolfræður leaves the goats behind. So is this an oversight, or were they left as an offering for the supernatural being? They're described as precious. So there's extreme economy of expression here. There are lots of gaps and blanks, and there's a complete absence of any moral judgment. And we never do, in fact, find out who this mysterious man is. So what are the different ways in which we can understand this relationship between biblical style and saga style? I think there are two main ways. And for the first one, I've tried to use a biological metaphor, it's always dangerous, which is convergent evolution. And convergent evolution is the way in which, I'm going to read this out so I get it right, in response to environmental pressures, two species which are otherwise independent evolve similar features which are not present in any common ancestor. The best known example is echolocation, which evolved independently in bats and dolphins. And what this means in literary terms is that we're dealing here with two forms of storytelling that have come to resemble each other, not because of any contact between them, but because of the sorts of environments in which they arose. And this could have something to do with being small nations that have something to prove. It might have to do with the circumstances of settlement and the sense of being unique and different. It certainly, I think, has something to do with what happens when oral traditions of storytelling are incorporated into a literary culture, producing in both cases a rich and masterful tradition of narrative prose. And David Damrosch, I think, writes well about the rise of historical writing in ancient Israel and its connection to cultural identity. That's something that's also been much discussed in saga scholarship. But of course, it also wouldn't be difficult at all to list all the differences between medieval Iceland and ancient Israel. The other solution is to assume that the narrative art of the Old Testament has influenced in some way the style of the Icelandic sagas. And it's interesting that this has never really been considered by scholars of medieval Icelandic literature. There are a number of reasons for that, but probably the most important one is that the translations of the Old Testament into Old Norse are relatively late, so they don't predate the sagas. But, of course, not all the saga authors would have needed a translation in order to read the Old Testament. Some of them would have been able to read it in Latin, or would have heard the stories in homilies, or would have accessed them through oral circulation. So I do think that in some cases, especially where we find similar motifs, we have to consider the possibility of borrowing. And here we come on to something quite important, and that's that when biblical scholars use the Icelandic sagas as comparative literature, they often don't consider the possibility that the sagas might have borrowed from the Old Testament. So there's an assumption that these are two traditions that are completely separate. When Van Serter proposes the sagas as the most appropriate comparative literature for the David story, he doesn't mention that the David story was known in Norway and Iceland by at least 1200 and probably before. And to show how this complicates things, I want to take an example from Maya Sternberg's book on the poetics of biblical narrative. So this is, for those of you that have got handouts, these passages are number 2 on the handouts, and here you do have a saga passage and a Bible passage to compare. So what Sternberg does is to compare the portrait of Gunnar in Njál's saga with the portrait of Absalom in 2 Samuel 14. And Sternberg argues that these two portraits are given for different reasons. So he says the portrait of Gunnar and the detail about his nose being upturned is there for solidity of specification. In other words, to make him feel like a real person. Whereas the reason we're told about Absalom's hair is because it points forward to how Absalom will die, when in 2 Samuel 18 he gets his head caught in the branches of a tree and David's men surround and kill him. And Sternberg calls this realistic indirection or proleptic portraiture, which I find really hard to say. But there's a much closer parallel in Njál's saga that Sternberg misses because he's looking at the wrong person. When Gunnar's wife-to-be, Hartelgerðr, is first introduced in chapter 1, we're told she was fair of face and tall of growth, and her hair was as soft as silk. It was so long too that it came down to her waist. But when Gunnar is ambushed in his home in chapter 77 and his bowstring breaks, he asks for 2 strands of Hartelgerðr's hair, and they have the following conversation. "Does anything depend on it?" she says. "My life depends on it," he replies, "for they will never get near me if I can keep them off with my bow." "Then," she says, "I will remind you of that slap you gave me, and I don't care whether you hold out for a long while or not." He doesn't get the strands of hair, and the result of this is that he's killed. So actually, we've got realistic indirection in both the saga and in the Bible, and in both cases, I think, the hair is more than just hair. So Absalom's abundant hair tells us something about his vanity and self-indulgence. It's these qualities, rather than just getting it tangled up, that brings about his downfall. In Njál's saga, on the other hand, Hartelgerðr's hair tells us something not about her, but about Gunnar. It tells us that he's dangerously susceptible to female charms. It's a woman that brings about his downfall. It's more like the story of Samson and Delilah. So the question here is this just a narrative device that both the saga author and the biblical author happen to be using, and the fact that in both cases it's about hair is just a coincidence? Or could the saga author have learned this technique of realistic indirection from the Old Testament? I'm not going to answer that question. So I want to look now at a few more scenes like this in Laxdæla saga. Now, Laxdæla saga is a saga that biblical scholars tend not to read. They usually favour Njál's saga for some reason, and that's a mistake because Laxdæla saga has far more Old Testament themes in it, especially around inheritance and land. And Laxdæla saga has a story in it that is, I think, a close parallel to the story of Sarah and Hagar in Genesis 16 and 21. And I'm sure you all know that what happens in Genesis 16 is that because Sarah isn't able to conceive, she sends the enslaved Egyptian woman Hagar to Abraham instead, and Hagar conceives a son, Ishmael. And once she's pregnant, we're told that Hagar looks with contempt on Sarah and that Sarah treats her harshly. In the Latin, Sarah afflicts her. So there's this interesting dynamic whereby the social status of these women changes depending on their reproductive capacity. The story in Laxdæla saga works very similarly. So one of the main male characters, Höskuldur, goes abroad and he buys an Irish slave called Melkorka. And when Höskuldur brings Melkorka home, his wife Jorun is very unhappy about it. And we're explicitly told that Höskuldur slept with his wife every night after he got back. But then Melkorka becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son. And it turns out that both of them have royal ancestry. And these two circumstances lead to a significant deterioration in the relationship between the two women. And this is passages on the handout, I think. So we're told Jorun was not any better disposed to Melkorka, than before, but Höskuldur was somewhat nicer. And a little later, when Jorun was going to bed, Melkorka took off her shoes and stockings and laid them on the ground. Jorun took the stockings and struck her about the head. I don't have the rest of the passage on my script, but Jorun punches her in the nose, I think, or Melkorka punches Jorun in the nose. And Höskuldur ends up having to send Melkorka and her son away, just as Hagar and Ishmael are sent away in Genesis 21. And in many ways, this scene between the two women in the saga seems to develop imaginatively what the biblical author might have meant when he says that Hagar despises Sarah and that Sarah afflicts her. And if you look at medieval commentary on the Bible, you'll see that there are very similar ways of picturing this. So in the Isabella Psalter, for example, you have Sarah brandishing a long stick at Hagar. And then in the Egerton Genesis, you've got Sarah threatening Hagar with a distaff, while Hagar leans away and raises her hand to protect herself. But the closest parallel that I've found to the scene in Laxdæla saga is actually in rabbinic exegesis in the Genesis Rabbah. And that puts forward three possibilities for what Sarah afflicting Hagar might mean. The first is that Sarah denied Hagar the marital bed, which Jorun also does when Melkorka first arrives. The second is that she hit her with a slipper, which is tantalisingly close to the episode with the stockings. And the third is that she set her demeaning household tasks, such as helping her to bathe. And in Laxdæla saga, Melkorka is helping Jorun to undress. So there's a really close relationship here, I think, between the saga and then the story in the Old Testament and then interpretations of that story. As well as the power struggle between the women and their shifting social status, there's also the issue of inheritance. And this comes to a head in Genesis 21, when we're told that Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. That's the New Revised Standard Translation. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out the slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son." Exactly the same phrase, the son of the slave woman, is used actually multiple times in Laxdæla saga, but the example I've given you is important because it's said by Höskuldur's wife, Jorun. So when Melkorka's son returns from abroad, having enriched himself substantially, she comments bitterly, "That son of a slave woman certainly has enough wealth to ensure that his name is remembered." And the Old Norse word used in the saga, Ambautarssonur, is exactly the same word that's used to describe Ishmael in the Old Norse translation of Genesis 21. But what I'm more interested in here is the scene with the two boys playing and what Sarah makes of it. And there's a lot of discussion about exactly what the Hebrew verb translated as playing in this scene means, because the Hebrew reads more like, "Then Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian laughing. But that could mean either to laugh in merriment or to laugh in scorn, or by extension to make sport, to jest, to play, even to caress, but there's no object. And Jerome suggested a couple of possibilities which are listed in the marginal gloss in the medieval Glossa Ordinaria. And the first thing he suggests is that Ishmael had made games with idols. And he suggests that because exactly the same verb is used in Exodus 32 when the Israelites make a golden calf. And the second suggestion is that Ishmael had, in a game, claimed the rights of the firstborn son for himself on the grounds that he was older. So you can see here that there's a desire not just to make sense of this verb, but also to justify Sarah's response. You know, what could possibly be wrong with two boys playing? There must be more going on here. And again, if you look at the various manuscript illuminations, you can see various interpretations of exactly what Ishmael was up to, including Jerome's idea that Ishmael was enticing Isaac to worship idols and that this led to a fight, or simply that Ishmael was bullying the younger boy. It's actually funny because the scribe has written Ishmael over Isaac and then rubbed it out and written it over Ishmael instead there. And here, this is the Old English Hexateuch, and I think probably Ishmael seems to be stealing Isaac's balls there. So I'm interested in this because it corresponds to a type scene in the sagas that recurs multiple times. And I want to just give you some examples of these. Again, they're on the handout rather than on the slides. Sometimes the boys in question in the sagas are foster brothers or half-brothers, and sometimes they're related in other ways. So, for example, in Laxdæla saga, a man called Gjester sees two young men swimming together, Kjartan and Botli. And Kjartan and Botli's parents are half-siblings. They're both grandchildren of Höskuldr, but Kjartan's grandmother is Melkorka, who's enslaved, while Botli is the grandson of Höskuldr's legitimate wife. So you can see there's going to be family tensions here. And we're told that Gjester, so the young men have been swimming, and Gjester looked at the young men for a while. And then later, he tells his companion, "It will not take me by surprise if Botli is to stand over Kjartan's corpse and in this way bring about his own death." And this is what happens. Botli and Kjartan fall out over a woman, and Botli ends up killing Kjartan. So that's the first one under 6 on the handout. And then under number 7, there's a scene from Via Gloom Saga, Killer Gloom Saga, in which two cousins are playing. And we're told when one was 4 years old and the other 6, they were playing during the day, and Steinolva asked Arngrímur to lend him a toy horse. Arngrímur answers, "I'll give it to you because it's a better toy for you than me, because of our ages." And Steinolva told his foster mother what a good gift he'd received. And she says something like, "It's very nice that you're so kind to each other." But a travelling prophetess, Oddbjörg, interprets the scene quite differently. She says, "I can tell you that each will bring about the death by spear of the other, and one bad thing after another will come to pass." And finally, under number 8, there's a scene in Egil's Saga Skallagrimssonar, in which the 7-year-old Egil gets into a spot of trouble with a bigger boy, an 11-year-old. And we're told when they began to play, Egil was weaker. Also, Grímur exploited the difference as much as he could. Then Egil got angry and lifted up the bat and hit Grímur. And Grímur grabbed him and threw him down, and he treated him rather roughly. And actually, Egil goes on to kill him. He's a bit precocious with his killings. He's 7 years old. When he gets home, his parents interpret the scene rather differently. So when Egil came home, Skallagrímur, his father, didn't have much to say about it, but Bera, his mother, said that Egil had the makings of a Viking. So sibling relations are central to both the sagas of Icelanders and to the Old Testament. But siblings and relations falling out is not so rare a theme that we have to assume that one tradition is borrowing from another. But a scene in which someone sees two boys playing and from that predicts a future falling out, that's a more substantial similarity, I think. And there are close parallels in how each scene is depicted. So in each case, there's a viewer who looks on, and there are two children who are related in some way and who don't know that they're being watched. And the children do something apparently innocent, and then the viewer interprets it in relation to a future event, in all cases actually negatively here. But there's a kind of disconnection between the event and the interpretation. So why would Ishmael playing with his little brother Isaac prompt Sarah to send Hagar and Ishmael away? I mean, we might guess that Ishmael's being rough, or even that Sarah doesn't want them to be friends, but we're not told this. We have to fill in the blank ourselves. And the scenes in the sagas are exactly the same. So what is it about Kjartan and Botley swimming together that causes Gjester to predict their future strife? Why should Artengrimer's generosity to his brother, handing him a toy that he wants, mean that the two of them will go on to kill each other? It's a bit more obvious in the case of Etel that he's going to be troublesome. In this case, his father's silence speaks more loudly than his mother's approving comment. But my point is that it's not just that these scenes are about the same thing, but that they're all narrated in the same way. So, either the Old Testament story about Isaac and Ishmael and the way it's interpreted in the Middle Ages, either that just happens to follow exactly the same pattern as a type scene in the sagas, perhaps because of shared concerns with family dynamics and half-siblings and inheritance and so on. Or the scene where Ishmael plays with Isaac and the various interpretations around it are the source of this type scene in the sagas, in which case what we're seeing here is to do with reception rather than with convergence. So at this point, I'm going to try to draw some conclusions. So first of all, I think there is a genuine likeness between biblical style and saga style, which is not to do with borrowing or influence, but has to do with a real affinity between these two traditions of storytelling. And more collaboration between biblical scholars and saga scholars would be really rewarding, I think, in allowing us to understand the narrative art of these stories more fully and to compare in both cases how this narrative art develops over time. But at the same time, we have to recognise that the Icelandic sagas are not just comparative literature for the Bible. The saga authors knew the Bible, or they knew parts of it, they knew the historical narrative parts of it, they were interested in biblical stories, and they used these in their own storytelling. So where we find similarities, we have to consider the possibility of borrowing. And there's a lot more work to be done here on the reception of the Bible in the Icelandic sagas. And finally, this is a conjecture, but I wonder whether the Icelanders might bring something unique to biblical interpretation in the Middle Ages. From the 12th century on, there was an increasing interest across medieval Europe in the Bible as history, as story, particularly among educated lay people who were keen to know about the most recent biblical scholarship. And the old Icelandic translations of the Bible very much belong to this sort of cultural movement. But I wonder whether the Icelanders might have had a privileged insight into the narrative art of biblical stories precisely because these stories work in the same way as the stories in the Icelandic sagas. And here it would be really interesting to compare with other medieval vernacular translations of the Bible to see whether there is anything distinctive about the Icelandic ones. My guess would be that there is, but that is work that is still to be done. So I'm going to end there.
questions, and I can see some hands already shooting up. So yes, please.
That was really, really wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So in comparing the sagas, has anyone done any comparison with things like the Kalevala or the fairy tales of Grimm? I know these are different settings. Maybe like the Kalevala may be very old and oral, and so there's differences. But are these characteristics that you saw, are how characteristic are they of many different cultures?
Yeah. So I think a lot of bits of the saga that we might say, you know, there's definitely kind of elements of oral tradition or oral formula here. Many of those also occur in other literatures that have developed out of oral tradition. I think the difference with things like the Kalevala, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's poetry, isn't it?
Well, I'm no expert, but I think it is.
Yeah, I think the difference here, so there's lots of epic poetry, and lots of people have written on epic poetry and included actually Icelandic epic poetry in those studies. But the difference here is that the sagas are prose.
Okay.
And so what I think is really interesting is in both cases you've got this kind of prose tradition that's arisen out of kind of oral storytelling, and that seems to me to be part of what's distinctive about these two particular traditions.
Yeah.
But you could absolutely compare. I mean, there are definitely also folktale motifs in the sagas, and there's heroic poetry which you could absolutely compare with the Kalevala.
Yes.
Yes, could you repeat that word that is used in both the Bible and the sagas for the son of a slave woman?
Yeah, the umbautar sonur.
Beautiful word. Does that have any pejorative connotations?
Yes, I think it does. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely, in both cases. Yeah.
Because one of the things that I find interesting is that whether it's Ishmael and Isaac, or whether it's, and I can't remember the names of the characters in the saga, in each case, one is meant to be cast aside so that the other is able to achieve a destiny, and oh, by the way, that destiny just happens to be our present.
Yes.
You know, whatever our present might be. So I'm wondering if there's a parallel in sort of the teleologies of those stories, that they're meant to explain, you know, who we are today and why what we have today is. And the reason is because, you know, the word I'm using to describe the son of a slave woman is so negative.
Yeah, there's several interesting things there. I mean, Icelanders still trace their descent from saga heroes, many of them, and you know, there are so many genealogies in the sagas precisely because these are characters that are part of a community's past. So you're absolutely right that they relate to the present of the community. Laxdæla saga kind of subverts the thing about the illegitimate son is put to one side because Kjartan actually turns out to be a really important and impressive character. He's the grandson of Melkorka, the Irish slave. But I think that is a kind of deliberate inversion. But there is a whole issue about inheritance, what the sons are going to inherit, and Höskuldur actually tricks his sons into giving his illegitimate son more of the inheritance than he's supposed to. So there is a bit of a Jacob and Esau thing going on in the middle as well that I didn't have time to cover. But you're absolutely right. Yes.
Interesting. Thank you.
That's okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question about the folio 227. And if you can go to it, please.
This one or this one?
To this one.
Yeah.
So at the bottom on the left there is either a ram or a goat. I wonder if it is related to the story to what extent.
Yeah. It could be connecting a motif that connects what's going on up here with what's going on down here, like the sword, because he's holding the sword here that he uses to sacrifice Isaac there, so a way of kind of connecting those two scenes, because this is Genesis 12 and that's Genesis 22. And what's interesting is this comes at the very beginning of the kind of the story of Abraham. So the sacrifice of Isaac is the lens through which we then read the rest of the story of Abraham. So you're definitely meant to kind of pause and reflect on it and bring its significance into what you're reading. you've also got Isaac here, Abraham here pointing at the text, and just above here it reads, Abraham departed from Haran, so he's kind of pointing to the divine command to leave.
Okay.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it?
It's our Father George and then
I wasn't going to ask this, but I'll just in passing. Is the ram on top of a mound? Could that be meant to be Golgotha, or I can't really tell from where I'm sitting if it is a mound.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to ask was something a bit different. Was if you know the Icelandic Sagas well, if you do, then do people who know the Sagas well, do they see new things in the Old Testament? Does it help you to see things theologically come to life, or themes or ideas that we might miss otherwise? Do you think it has that effect? And if so, maybe an example of?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm wondering. I mean, that's my last conjecture about whether, when we look at kind of Icelandic biblical interpretation, there's stuff there that we don't find anywhere else, because there's a kind of understanding on a deep level of this kind of story. I mean, I'm not quite in a position to answer that question yet, but that's what I wonder. I mean, certainly the story that I've looked at in most detail is the translation of the story of Samson. The Icelanders absolutely love Samson because he's so like a saga hero. He's just like, one of the characters in, there's a type of saga called the saga of poets, where the poets are always really problematic and violent and kind of difficult characters, and he's just like one of those. And what's interesting is that when the saga author translates the riddle, he knows that it's poetry, even though he's reading it in the Latin Vulgate and it doesn't have anything that marks it out as poetry. And I think he's kind of identified that Samson is a poet on the basis of his relationship to the poets in the poets' sagas. So I think you do get these moments of insight. And there's also a very interesting, the saga author is very interested in irony in that story. He's very interested in the way that Samson at the end is put in a position where is put in the same position that he puts the Philistines in all the way through, and there's added kind of layers of irony all the way through the translation to bring out that moment as significant. So I think there are things there that you don't find elsewhere, but they're to do primarily with the kind of literal level of interpretation, so understanding the kind of human dynamics of the story, I think, which, I mean, doesn't necessarily conflict with the theological interpretation and can feed into it. And the translations of the Bible do have kind of allegorical interpretations attached to them, but what they do is they translate a chunk of Judges and then they give you a paragraph of allegorical interpretation, and then you get another chunk, and then you get another. So it's interesting because you're reading narrative and then allegory and narrative and allegory, so you're always balancing the two.
Would an Icelander be supposed to read the sagas through the lens of Christian interpretation in the way that, if they're already Christian, the way that one might say Samson takes on new layers for somebody who reads it through the New Testament? Do they do something similar?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Samson is actually, it's entitled Samson's Saga in the translation of Judges, and it's so popular that it's copied kind of independently with Icelandic sagas. Whether the Icelanders read the sagas theologically, that's a big question. I do definitely have doctoral students trying to show that that's the case. Not everybody would agree with it, but the saga authors were Christians. They did read the Bible. They did read saints' lives. They weren't insulated from kind of Western Christian culture. It wasn't a kind of bastion of pure Germanic heroism, as people thought in the 19th century. So I think there's absolutely things that you can read biblically in the sagas and things that you can read like sagas in the Bible. Is both ways.
Very interesting.
Sian, thank you. That was really fascinating. Last time we were thinking about biblical interpretation of biblical narrative, and we were introduced to the theme by talking about Eric Auerbach's book, Mimesis.
Yes.
Can I just quote a couple of passages and then ask a question?
Okay.
So Auerbach says, far from seeking like Homer merely to make us forget our reality for a few hours, the biblical narrative seeks to overcome our reality. We are to fit our own life story into its world, feel ourselves to be elements in its structure of universal history. And he develops this thing particularly in relation to features of the biblical narrative which Robert Alter is getting at, and which you yourself illustrated from the sagas. So then Auerbach goes on to say, everything else that happens in the world can only be conceived as an element in this sequence of biblical narrative. Into it, everything that is known about the world must be fitted as an ingredient of the divine plan.
Yes.
What you said to Father George and what you said earlier about genealogy kind of relates to the question which I was going to ask, which is the extent to which the sagas are a means by which Icelanders then and now live themselves into the world as Scripture, Old Testament narrative, teaches them that the world is.
Mm.
I mean that's not a kind of particularly
No.
scholarly question, I suppose.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
but
I mean,
from your knowledge of
yeah.
Icelandic culture in general, you spoke about how people trace their genealogies back to the sagas. Is there a continuing, ongoing effect?
Yes,
of
there
seeing
absolutely
the
is,
world?
and you get. I mean, most of the sagas are written down in the 13th and 14th century, but most of the manuscripts are 15th, 16th, 17th century. I mean, people are copying Njarl's saga by hand in the 19th century on Icelandic farms. So the sagas are really important to how the Icelanders define themselves as a people. That's absolutely right.
But are they seeing themselves and understanding that? Do we know anything about how they see their lives in the here and now, say in the 19th century when they're transcribing the Njarl saga?
Yeah.
Are they doing that just simply because it's a great story and an etiological legend, or are they doing it because it enables them to make sense of who they are, where they are now?
I think both. Absolutely. I mean, I don't want to overclaim that all Icelanders spend all of their time reading the sagas. I remember when I actually gave a talk about the sagas in an Icelandic school when we were staying there, and I asked the children what they'd read, and they'd only actually read the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, but they knew everything in it. They were all like, oh, Egil kills his first man when he's 7, and he proposes his first pair when he was 4. They absolutely loved it. But I wonder whether, that was in Reykjavik. I wonder whether in other places in Iceland there might be more of a more knowledge of the sagas.
So does God feature in their sense of...
God doesn't feature in the not
No, but
in
in
the
their
sagas
sense of
of Icelanders,
self-identity.
really.
No.
Sorry,
Yeah.
no, not really. I mean, there are Christian motifs in the sagas, and there are scenes that you could potentially there's a kind of understanding of the pagan past as equivalent to the Old Testament. So that idea that the sort of pagan Icelanders are kind of in the same position as the Israelites in the Old Testament. So that connection is made. But I wouldn't say, and this is I guess the main difference between the sagas and the Hebrew Bible is that there isn't a kind of theological. I don't think there's a theological vision that is mediated by the sagas. I mean,
Thank you.
people can correct me on that if they want to, but I don't think there is.
Thank you.
I was going to ask, coming back to Kjartan and Botany, I think that's a really interesting passage with the bathing and the kind of interpretation of that. And I was wondering, Kjartan is a character who seems to have a lot of potential biblical parallels occurring around him, but as someone who's not as well versed in that and is more a saga person than a Bible person in this instance, I would say the only stuff I immediately think of is John the Baptist later on with Olaf Tryggvason and stuff. But could you talk more about?
That's interesting.
Do you think there's anything
maybe.
particularly else that you would attach to him as well, like in terms of stories that seem to parallel his life?
Kjartan. And it's interesting because Kjartan does become Christian halfway through the saga. He goes back to Iceland and fasts during Lent, and everyone's amazed that he can survive for so long without eating meat. So that's rather a nice story. I've looked more, I mean, the Old Testament parallels that I've seen are around that family line, but not specifically Kjartan. So Höskuldur and Olafur and the whole issue about inheritance. And the bit where Olafur lines up all his livestock in a huge row, all the way from his old farm to his new farm, always reminds me of, you know, Jacob when he's going back to see Esau and he lines everybody up. So I do think potentially there are a lot of Old Testament parallels in Laxdæla saga, but nobody's kind of sort of sat down and
is he almost a New
found
Testament
them.
figure then? Is Kjartan, because Kjartan converts, is there almost something?
Yeah, I guess
and
so.
he has a sort of very sort of Christ-like death.
Yeah. And actually there is the swimming competition with Oliver Tryggvason, isn't there, where the Christian king dunks him into the water. I think they 3 times, isn't it? So you're absolutely right. Yeah, John the Baptist is an apt comparison. Yeah, I think there's a lot in that saga that hasn't really been looked at yet. So if anyone wants a project, that's a good one.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, kind of in the manner of how this comes into discussion of Beowulf, do you think, both more generally and specifically, does apocryphal influences, like say the Book of Enoch, come in and influence either like the Fornaldur Sogur, the sagas of ancient times, or any sagas really?
So I don't think anyone has looked at that. So that's a good question. Trying to think of what apocrypha have even been properly edited. I mean, the interesting thing about Old Icelandic is that people have focused so much on the sagas, and there are all these translations which, you know, aren't translated, haven't been properly edited. Some of them haven't been edited at all. So there's a lot of religious literature out there that people haven't been interested in looking at because their vision of Icelandic is that it's, you know, it's secular and it's heroic, and so on. I think probably there is. I think, you know, the Icelanders are reading at the episcopal sees, at the monasteries. They're reading the same things that people are reading in Europe. So potentially there's a lot to be done there. But again, it hasn't been done yet. I mean, the translations that we looked at are, some of them are not just translations. They also have interpretation incorporated into them. So there's quite a lot from the Glossa Ordinaria, Jerome, Bede, Gregory the Great, Augustine, and so on, that's incorporated into those. So that gives you some sort of sense of what the library might have been like in the places where these Bible translations were put together. I think they're up to date with their biblical interpretation. Thanks.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. Beginning with this sort of huge question. When you hold the saga style and biblical style, these two very similar literary forms and narrative art. So when they come together in those translations of the Bible, is there almost this like seamless sliding in of one narrative form into a pre-existing one that has developed independently or alongside?
Yeah, I think to some extent there is, and it's really interesting because Genesis, you know, it starts with the sort of accounts of the creation and the flood and so on, and there's nothing particularly saga-like about them. But as soon as you get onto Abraham, Jacob and Esau, and all those kind of family stories with family dynamics, you start to find exactly the same vocabulary that's used in the Icelandic sagas. And the translation that runs from Joshua to the end of 2 Kings is an absolutely wonderful translation that is in which the stories are very much presented as sagas. It's not entirely seamless, I think. You've still got the translator trying to fill in some of the gaps. There's not quite the same economy of expression that you find in the biblical narrative, but there's definitely a kind of wholesale embracing of these narratives as saga-like in the translations. Yeah, it's really fascinating to see what happens. Yeah.
I'd like to ask, as someone who's studied neither Hebrew nor Icelandic, are there any similarities in the linguistic features or grammatical features of the languages that makes them both very suited to storytelling in a very concise, in a very laconic way?
Yeah. That is a very good question that I do not feel qualified to answer. I think I did try and look at the Hebrew and then the Latin Vulgate and then the Icelandic to see whether the Icelandic was more like the Latin, more like Jerome's translation, or more like the Hebrew. It's interesting because Jerome uses a lot more variation actually than the Hebrew, and the Icelandic Sagas is more like the Hebrew in that respect. So I tried to do a little bit of work on that, but it's, I'm not a good enough linguist, I think, to be able to compare the structure of biblical Hebrew with Old Icelandic.
There's another default topic.
That is a default topic, absolutely.
Yes. In the Old Testament narratives, if you see a man walk up to a well and there's a woman there, something's really going on. Is there any similar? Where do the couples meet in the Icelandic sagas? Is there a similar kind of type scene?
Yeah, good question. I mean, they don't always meet beforehand. Often that marriages are just negotiated with the father. But the Althing, actually, that is somewhere that's where Gunnar meets Hallgerður at the Althing for the first time, and he does walk up to her, and they start talking. I'm wondering whether there could be parallels between scenes set at well and scenes set at hot springs in the Icelandic sagas, but I don't know. It would be interesting to look at that.
Has real potential.
Yeah.
Another default topic.
Yeah, I'm going to have to write this down as soon as I need.
Any more questions?
Well,
yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
You've kind of already answered this question, but I read somewhere that, I think it might be in relation to the Prose Edda rather than the sagas, but that there was sort of a deliberate attempt from the Christians writing these down to reconcile their own stories with the biblical narrative. Do you give any credence to that opinion, or is that sort of uniquely mythological thing, really?
I think as a Christian, that does impact on the way that Snorri Sturluson tells the stories about the pagan gods in the Edda, although perhaps not as much as you might think. So there's not a really strong urge to allegorise or moralise them, but there is a desire to make it clear that they are fictional rather than real. So I think it's absolutely right that Snorri Sturluson, it's not as if he could have put aside his Christian upbringing and written this story as if it was purely pagan.
Any other more questions? Okay then. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say one more about Laxdæla song, because I thought that was very interesting. Is there anything else in that you would pull out a really interesting biblical parallel for? Because evidently it's one that's kind of not been looked at enough, I think.
Yeah. You've almost exhausted my supply of parallels between the Laxdæla saga and the Old Testament, but there is a Samson and Delilah story where there's an outlaw who the men want to catch, and they catch him by waiting until he visits his mistress, and then he puts his head on her lap and falls asleep. And she's, I think, combing his hair or something. There's something with the hair. She's picking lice out of his hair, I think. And she's a characteristic Icelandic endearment. And then they come in and catch him while he's asleep. So and nobody's noticed that, you see.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting.
Just your personal opinion, because as someone who works very closely with sagas, you have a very specific idea and a very specific meaning for the word saga.
Yeah.
How do you feel about how the word saga is used in pop culture today? Star Wars is a saga. The Marvel universe is a saga. Just what's your personal feeling on the use of that word in pop culture?
I am not sure that I have a personal opinion on this. I mean, I guess it's something that you want to sort of talk about with students when you're talking about what a saga is, because I think often, well, at least in the past, saga just meant a long kind of interminable narrative, which of course sagas aren't always. I mean, you might think some of them are interminable. So sometimes it can be the source of misconceptions, but words change their meanings, and it's good that it's still in use, so I'm not going to complain about it.
Well, just before we draw things to a close and thank Professor Grønlie, Father George has one thing he wants to just
to mention. In typical Oxford congruence, next door a book is being launched by a fellow at St. Cross by Dr. Francis Lenehan about old English biblical prose and looking at the. So if any of you are keen on the way in which English translations of the scriptures in the 9th and the 11th century brought in some of the great stories of the Old Testament to the lay world earlier than people necessarily think. That's the subject of that book. And I also mentioned before we hear thanks for such a fascinating and stimulating lecture, that if you're interested in the liturgical presentation of the saga of Noah, interpreted by the saga of Simeon and the Mother of God, I mean, that might be happening at Evensong this evening.
I can't have a stronger advert than that. Evensong will follow at 5:30, and please join me in thanking Professor Grønlie.